Today's episode is brought to you by Media for All, which was set up to help encourage more Black, Asian, and other ethnic talent into media, and to provide a support and mentoring network to ensure talent flourishes in the media industry that we all love. If you're looking for a mentor or would like to mentor young ethnic talent, check them out at mediaforall.org.uk, and it is all 100% free. Hello and welcome to the Shiny New Object podcast. My name is Tom Ollerton. I'm the founder of Automated Creative, and this is a weekly marketing podcast about the future of the industry. And every week I have the pleasure and the privilege of speaking to some of the brightest lights in the industry, and this week is no different. I am on a call with Richard Levy, who is head of marketing for Europe for OFX. So hi Richard, thanks for joining. So if anyone is listening to this podcast who doesn't know who you are or what you do, could you just give yourself a bit of introduction and an overview?
Yeah, sure, Tom. I mean, firstly, thanks for the invite. It's great to be here. So as you say, I head up Europe from a marketing perspective for OFX. I'm actually relatively new to the role. I've been there 5 or 6 months, so still getting to grips with it. Prior to that, I headed up Europe for MoneyGram, which is a money transfer business for a decade, actually. So I was there quite a long time. And prior to that, I worked at other businesses such as GE, GE Money, and Santander. So you will notice, Tom, a consistent theme that I've been in marketing now for quite a while and always in the financial services sector. So that's a brief overview of how I've ended up where I am.
Well, thank you very much. And was there a reason that you've stayed in finance? Do you love it, or is it just the way the cookies crumble?
That's a good question. I'd love to sit here, Tom, and say to you I had this master plan when I was 18, but actually that would be entirely wrong. I graduated from university, and you may be familiar with a thing called the Milk Round, where you apply to various blue chip companies to get onto their graduate scheme. And I ended up a few years ago, or many years ago now, on the Abbey National graduate scheme. I also interviewed, if I remember correctly, for companies such as Ford, GlaxoSmithKline, Rolls-Royce, etc. So I think because I graduated with a business degree, so the advantage is you have various options. I guess the disadvantage is that you don't have a set career path. So Abby took me on all those years ago, and I think financial services is relatively interesting for me because it impacts us all pretty much on a daily basis. And I think once you start establishing a particular specialism, I guess, within marketing, then you do it for so long, it just becomes what you do. So it's now, I guess, I would call myself a pretty much a sort of financial services marketeer, although marketing is pretty transferable from a skill point of view. But there was no master plan, Tom. It just ended up that way. And I think once you've done it for a while, that's where you're most comfortable and where you build up your expertise. So it's just been how the cookie has crumbled as the years have gone on.
So are you a marketing book reader? Do you buy marketing books for your team or recommend them?
I do, Tom, I do. And I'm actually, I think one of the interesting things about the last 20 odd years in marketing is that I think if you'd asked me that 20 years ago, you would have gone for a very traditional marketing book like Kotler on Marketing, right? What was the book everybody read at university? And it's exceptionally good as a text, but it's very academic by nature. And obviously Kotler remains, I guess, in some ways the sort of godfather of marketing. So you would sort of start off with that. But I think more recently, Tom, and to answer your question, I'm a pretty avid reader. The books I've probably been reading in the last few years, and I'll try and narrow it down to one or two in the end. But How to Win, which was a strategic book, actually, by people that ran Procter & Gamble for many years, I think is a superb book. Now, whether you'd actually call it a marketing book or a strategy book, I think is debatable. Maybe the two things are interchangeable, but that was probably the first book I read a few years ago. I thought, this is going to fundamentally change the way I think about work. And then there's other books that have come on the back of that. Good Strategy, Bad Strategy is quite, well, I'd recommend it to everybody. And it's the one actually at work for people that work in my teams that have always said, read it and understand it, because actually, is there a more misunderstood word than strategy, a more common word used than strategy and equally misunderstood? So that was a good book. But if I had to knock it down to the top three that I've read most recently. How Not to Plan by Les Burnett is superb, and it's in relatively sort of small chapters, and it just deals with the difference between perception and the way people do things in marketing and the reality and the impact it has. So I'd recommend that to anyone. Number two, How Brands Grow by Byron Sharp. It's academic, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily a page turner, but I think it's the marketing book of our time, actually. I think over the last decade, that book, for people that have read it, has changed all the perspectives of the way people look at marketing. And Byron Sharp is definitely someone worth following. But I think the number one book, if I had to be pressed on it, Tom, is a new one called Eat Your Greens. And I went to the book launch of it, I'm guessing about 18 months ago. It's actually 42 different chapters, some of which are very long, some of which are remarkably short. So it's probably only about 300 pages in total. But it's, as I say, 40 odd different chapters written by 42 different people. So each one gives a different perspective of the marketing world. And the only caveat to all of them is they had to be based in some degree of evidence. So they had to use evidence to support their stories. But it is, I think, a magnificent book, and the one I've probably most enjoyed, the one that's by my bookshelf most often, and definitely the one that I'd recommend to people that have been in marketing for many years, like you and I, or people that are just starting off. So that's the one.
So outside of books, what has been the best investment of your time, energy, or money in the last 5 years for your career?
I would probably argue, Tom, to that question, it would be the iPhone. Not necessarily because of its ability to make calls, but the reality is that you spend a lot of time, or you used to spend a lot of time at least, on the road or commuting or traveling in my previous world. And what the iPhone did was actually gives you access to articles and podcasts by some of the brightest marketing minds out there. So I'm thinking of the likes of the Tom Goodwins of this world, Mark Ritson, Helen Edwards, JP Caslin. So these guys who you can follow really easily on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Tom Roach is a recent one that I've been reading a lot about. So I think the iPhone, because what it does is you can store, as you know, a number of podcasts, not just on marketing actually, but on marketing, on business, on finance, on economics, on whatever really appeals to you, all stored in one place. Plus it gives you access, of course, to the internet, and following these guys. And actually, there's never been a better time, in my view, to be in marketing. To, again, to use my previous analogy, 20 years ago, Tom, you would have had to go to do a degree to learn all this stuff. Now you can pretty much, if you follow the right people on social media, you can effectively sort of teach yourself all the latest trends. And I think devices like the iPhone, which sounds so obvious, just didn't exist, right? Back in the 80s and the 90s, where you had to open up your textbook. So I think the most useful thing I bought is the iPhone, because I access it daily. I read on it, I listen to things on it, you can record things on it, and effectively it just acts like my little personal marketing trainer whenever I'm out and about, or if you do a run for an hour or so, you can just listen to some remarkable words of wisdom.
So it's interesting that you named so many people there, and in the previous question you named so many titles, so you take a huge amount of influence from external, but yet I'm sure in the 20 years that you've been in the game, you must have also learned from doing, right? I mean, you can read all the books you want about digital marketing, but until you run a campaign on any channel doing anything, you don't really know that much. So how what's the balance for you? How do you strike the balance between a third party person who's just talking about their experience and actually your gut feel based on your own?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, look, initially when I joined what's now Santander on the graduate scheme, Tom, I'd done a business degree. Marketing was a part of it, but by no means was the key element. So when you join, and I think there were 6 marketing graduates in my year, I guess, and none of us, if I recollect correctly, had done marketing degrees. And when I look back on that time, what was notable, and it may well have changed now because we're talking about quite a while ago, was that none of us were taught marketing as such. Even when we started work, you effectively learnt it on the job in a big corporate, a great corporate company to work for. And you came in and look, you don't want a graduate coming in and saying, oh, it's all about strategy and this is what I want to talk about. What you want your graduate to do is actually implement, learn, listen, and effectively really sort of get on with it, right? So I think I certainly spent the first part of my career just doing. And if I look at that from my sort of Santander days to First National, probably till halfway through my career at GE, it was very much implementation, learning from others, learning on the job, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work. I also think, Tom, that I was in a relatively privileged position, and still am, and as much as I've always worked for relatively large corporations. So effectively, if you were doing a startup with 3 people and you had about, £800 to your name, it's a very different game than if you're working for a big corporate that has the resources, the ability, and quite honestly, sort of other people that have been there and done it. So I think to some extent you have to be there, see it, do it, experience it, get it wrong, quite frankly, and just sort of learn from that view of the world. Then as you graduate through your career, you've also got to, I think, look at marketing, which is pretty misunderstood, I would argue, from the outside, and say, what is the difference between the good marketeers and the great marketeers? And, my view is the great marketeers have that curiosity, the humility to accept they certainly don't know it all, the ability to say, I need to talk to customers here, I need to get insight, I need to do my research, but not research for the sake of research for the insight it's going to give me, and then for the guidance it will provide. So I think we probably have all been in companies, right, where there's you do a lot of research and then it just sits on someone's desk and you sort of move on to the next one, and it's not really used. So I'm really talking about, using it for insight, and then you start looking much more strategically and you say, well, let's talk about segmentation and targeting and positioning, and actually a fair way, if not miles down that road, is the communications and the promotion element. So I think, in answer to your question, when you say, well, how much of it is learning on the job and how much of it is the theoretical side, like anything, it's a balance. Certainly when I first started, it was very much about learning on the job. But I think probably in the last sort of 5 years, 7 years, I've really tried to embrace experience from the outside. One, because it may reinforce your point of view, which is always good. But secondly, because it may make you think about things incredibly differently. And I'll give you an example of that. If you work for any brand, for any organization, you spend, let's just say, 40 hours a week working on it, thinking about it, talking about it, going home, contemplating it. Actually, in most cases, right, I'm sorry to break this to anyone, but in most cases, customers spend seconds thinking about your brand, right? I mean, it's just people actually have very busy lives and a lot going on, and the last thing they're doing is thinking about your brand in any way that you are thinking about it. And I think that, it's those kind of sort of very basic stuff that makes people think that when you hear people talking about it, you think, gosh, that's really true. And that's a really sort of simple example, but I just think it sort of shows the benefit of listening to other people. And likewise, I talk about Byron Sharp or say a Mark Ritson, and the debate about, do you go and target the entire market, which would be the sort of Byron Sharp argument? Do you go and target just a few narrow segments, which has always been the sort of Kotler-Ritson argument? That's very, very applicable to what you do. I mean, that's a fundamental decision as a marketeer that you're going to have to make, and you're going to have to get right, and you're going to have to defend. And as you go higher up in businesses, these are critical questions that you're expected to make. So I think it is a balancing act, Tom, but I think getting the views of others, their experiences, listening to it, I think is a great guidance in what you can do. Mix it in with your own experience over a reasonable period of time, and you should be in a fairly good place.
If you love all things innovation and want to understand how brands plan to emerge stronger from the current situation, don't forget to check out MadFest London on the 11th and 12th of November. My good friend Dan at MadFest knows how to put on a cracking event, and there's always plenty of amazing speakers, beer and cool people to meet. Check it out at www.madfestlondon.com. So we're at the halfway stage now, so we're going to talk about your shiny new object. So we discussed it was going to be the importance of training, which isn't potentially that shiny and new. So I'm kind of really interested to know, what is it about the importance of training that you think is new and something that marketers should be considering?
Well, I think look, it's not new in as much as, textbooks and, marketing has been around, since the days of sort of Procter and Gamble, sort of almost invented it. But I think what is quite new, Tom, is people actually saying, that marketing is not necessarily just creativity and common sense, right? And so what you're seeing is marketing coming under increased pressure as an industry. So if you go back to a very famous, but in my mind, a pretty sort of ridiculous quote where it was, I sort of spend 100% of my marketing budget, 50% is wasted. I just don't know what 50% it is. That quote, Tom, I think it is outdated, but perhaps is representative as marketing, of how marketing is seen, which is, we're very good at sort of spending the money as an industry. What we're not so good at is actually justifying it and demonstrating how it works. And if you look at business today generally, it's very short-term focused. A lot of the companies that are public have to report to the stock market quarterly. There's a great emphasis on return on investment, pretty much on the short term. I mean, you only have to look at the average lifetime spans of CEOs, CMOs, etc. What is that, 18 months to 3 years, right? So it tends to be relatively short-term focused, and therefore much sort of safer to concentrate on today and just get it right. And actually, if you look at marketing training, or you read the people like Bennett and Field, for example, that have done endless studies on marketing effectiveness, then what they'll say is actually short-term promotions work reasonably well, but only in the really, really short term. And the minute you stop doing them, the sales go back to their, well, where they were beforehand, but at worst even lower, because what you've effectively done is brought demand forward. So consequently, my point about people being trained is to understand that marketing is a short-term game and equally a long-term game, and how that has evolved through the years. One of the things, for example, that I think people get challenged on is, what's your return on investment? That's a good thing. And I think to an untrained marketeer, you would go out and you would say, well, I spent this and this is what I got back, and that's the percentage. The challenge of something like a return on investment, for example, is that actually what it does is it means the less you spend, the better return you normally get. Because if I spend £10 and I get 20 back, I've doubled my money. But if I spend 300,000 and I make 500,000, then I haven't doubled my money. So in a percentage terms, I've done worse. But in the reality terms, I've done much better. And I think this is how people need to start thinking going forward in a much more scientific way. And that just doesn't mean that we go in and we're all theoretical, we're out of touch with the real world, but it means that we're adding some degree of qualification to it. And, I've always used the example, Tom, that, no one goes up to an accountant in a business and says, can I just check your profit and loss? Because I just want to sort of go over it, because you assume that they've been trained and educated long enough that they know how to do it. And I think that's where marketing, as an industry needs to get to, because I was reading an IPA study, for example, when it said that 84% of ads can't be recalled the next day. Consumers are being hit by thousands of ads every day. How many do they actually remember? So I think it is a case that the more trained you are, the more you understand marketing, the more you understand the complexities of it, the difficulties of it, the impact it can have on a business. And not just the communication side, but also if you actually go back to what marketing is, what about pricing? which we seem to sort of lost control of in many businesses over the last 10 or 15 years, that's part of marketing. What about place, which effectively is a distribution channel, and looking at how that works? What about the product and the way, each touch point that the customer has with our own brands? What works, what doesn't work, what is frictionless, what causes issues, etc. So there's so much to marketing, and I think done correctly, the communication side, which is what we tend to be famous for, what we tend to obsess about, actually should be about 8 to 12% of a marketeer's job. So 88 to 92% should be about everything else, and that's the bit I think needs a little bit of recoaching. How many marketeers, Tom, that you know of, can go into a boardroom, talk about net profit, gross profit, earnings per share, as a consequence of the kind of sort of stuff that they have done? And I think it's those that can talk financially, can relate the financial side back to the activity they've done, show the growth in the business in the short term, in the long term, the impact of having a good and powerful brand, both from an employee point of view and an employer point of view and a financial point of view, and etc. It's these kind of guys that are going to rise to the top, and to do that, I think you need to be trained. I don't think you could just go in day one and just say, I've learned on the job. I think it's far more complex than that.
So if someone listening to this podcast, is convinced by this argument, and they think, right, I need to train for the short and the long term, I need to train to be able to directly attribute my activity to the business's bottom line, what are the steps that they would need to take to do that?
Well, look, the first thing I would say, and danger of repeating myself, is follow the right people, because I think actually there's a lot of people that have been down the paths before, and I think it's a lot of it is about sort of educational, as I say. So follow the right people, read the right books, and it's easier to do that from now than it's ever been before. Just follow 20, 30 people on social media, go to the conferences, go listen to the podcasts such as this one, get the different experiences, and understand what it is you want to do and where you want to go, and also what part you want to specialize in. But there's I was talking to someone the other day, and I literally said, what is it you want to do, right? If you want to become a digital specialist, I don't think that skill is going away, contrary to popular belief, then that's actually what you need to do, and you specialize in the digital world, and you become the expert in it, and you know what's going on with Google and Facebook, and that's a really, really valuable skill. If you want to become a CMO, it's much wider than that. You do need to know the financial element. You do need to know team management. You do need to know how to motivate people. You do need to know about culture. And actually, the great parody of all of this, Tom, is that the higher up you go in general, the less actual pure marketing you'll do, and it turns slightly more to a sort of general management role. Very important is obviously things like stakeholder management. So I would say to anyone, define, if you can, it was something that I didn't do. So I'm not saying that there's only one path, but if there's one particular element that really appeals to you, and you say, actually, what I want to do is be X, I want to get into the boardroom, then actually you're going to have to train yourself, not only in marketing, but the wider skills that go around that. If you want to specialize in one particular aspect of marketing, which is equally fine, then I think you go down a different path. But to anyone, I would say, follow the right people. That there's a number of training courses out there. Sort of Marketing Week do one with Mark Ritson that I've done, for example, which the initial one is on marketing and it's what they teach sort of MBA students. The second one is on brand management. I would highly recommend them. But if you can't afford it or you don't have the money, I still think there's a number of ways that people can do it. But if you're well trained and you know the difference between brand awareness and brand equity and how those two things play, if you know that writing a brand plan starts with diagnosis and moves to strategy and then finally hits the tactics, this stuff is all out there. And if you can educate yourself in it and take your profession really seriously, I think that you're going to rise to the top, because most people aren't in that position. but it's
So,
not. Yeah, go on.
so who do you think provides the most non-salesy advice? So I like that idea of following, the big hitters in the industry, but they're all selling something, whether it's their agency or it's their book or whatever. They're not. There's very few people who are just going on social media just for the love of marketing to help
Yeah.
people understand it. So how do you filter through the sales messages, even though they're not sort of click here or download now? How do you get the good stuff? And is there a source of all of this information that is free that you could go directly to without worrying that there was an agenda in the background?
But look, if you look at like the big agencies, the real big people, okay, I mean, let's say that sort of, I mentioned Bennett and Field before, that they've done numerous studies on marketing effectiveness, so that there should be nothing more important to any of us, to anyone listening to this, that says, I'm spending X amount of either my money or the company's money, or both, because it can be clearly your own business, and I want to know what I'm getting back for it. And I sort of said, return on investment is the most common way people look at it, but there's flaws to that process as well. So if you do a little bit of research, you're going to see that the people that have done most on that, as I say, are sort of Bennett and Field. If you Google them, most of their stuff, Tom, is available. Most of their stuff is free, and it just, the enemy of this is time, because it takes time to go through it, time to understand it, and time to be challenged on it. Because what I've also found is that a lot of you, I think what the two things it does is, one, it makes it very complex, because you suddenly realize, actually, this is damn difficult, right? This is no longer a subject about how many adverts can I get out, but if you're really measuring the effectiveness, it's actually hard, because we don't work in a scientific area where you add two chemicals together and the same thing happens every time. So you can do the best marketing campaign you want, but the reality is, we're going through COVID now. That changes absolutely everything to some extent. So there's no guarantee, even if you follow it right the way through, that you're going to get it right. But nevertheless, your chances are enormously increased, I think, if you read people like Bennett and Field. Most of it is free. None of it is particularly difficult to get hold of. What you've just got to do is know that it's there and show the desire. Now, if you can come back to your business and say, this is how marketing effectiveness works, this is the rigor I'm going to put behind the campaigns and the activity that I'm doing, then again, I just think you're in a really good place. And pick the area that interests you. I mean, I think, as I say, effectiveness is a key one that I've always found interesting, because I think marketeers generally get challenged quite extensively on the money they're spending. And if they can demonstrate where it's going and how it works, not in a hypothetical way, but in a real way, then I think you get a huge advantage. And I think your business will grow as a result of it. So I would say that there are people out there selling stuff, and I think you're absolutely right. But there's also a lot of people out there wanting to share wisdom, wanting to say, this is the way we've learned, these are the mistakes we've made. And I think everyone can benefit from that.
So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. If someone wants to get in touch with you about your ideas or your work, how would you like them to do that?
I'm pretty active, Tom, on LinkedIn. So I'm pretty easy to find. So Richard Levy, with Levy being my surname. And if people want to get in touch, I would sort of more than welcome that, and we can debate and discuss and take any points forward that I've talked about. And some people may agree, some may disagree. So would welcome the debate on it.
Brilliant. Well, look, Richard, thank you so much for your time.
No worries. It was a pleasure. Thank you for the invite.
Hi, just before you go, I'd really appreciate it if you could take the time to write a review of the Shiny New Object podcast on Apple Podcasts or iTunes, whatever it's called these days, or whichever podcast provider you use. We're an indie podcast, so it would go a long way for us if you could just share the word and give us a bit of a support on those channels. That'd just be fantastic. If you haven't got time, that's also cool. And yeah, if you could tell your colleagues about the podcast, and also, if possible, don't forget to subscribe. And I'd love to hear your feedback. If you'd like to speak on the podcast or be a guest, or you think I'm asking the wrong questions, anything, I'd be super interested to hear what you think. So please email me at tom@automatedcreative.net. That's TOM at, I'm not going to bother spelling it. Anyway, you'll work it out. Thanks so much.